you all for being here. I see a few new faces, so I'll just quickly explain how this program runs. Creative Response, the whole point is to bring in an expert in some field, and we try and find people who aren't just necessarily fine artists, but have expertise in some other area, and bring them in to get a fresh perspective on the work. So today we brought in Battista, who is a scientific and medical illustrator. She has her MA in Art as Applied to Medicine from Johns Hopkins, and she currently serves on the Board of Trustees of the Creative Alliance and Blue Water Baltimore. I'm really looking forward to hearing from a scientist, a scientist who creates imagery of the real world as this is all fictional worlds that were created for you. So from someone who translates the real world. So if you could join me in welcoming Battista.
It's a delight to be here. I didn't see the show, which was phenomenal. I loved hearing what you said about the imagery, that what's on the walls, like coming in like stained glass. But also it sometimes gets projected on the streets, I guess at night, which was the inside outside. I like the idea of that. So I'm going to just jump right in. I was going to start, so I'm a medical and biological illustrator. I think the request for someone to come and talk came through the Guild of Natural Science Illustrators, which is based through the Smithsonian. There's not a whole lot of medical and scientific illustrators out there. It's a pretty niche sort of profession. And in fact, there's two medical illustrators in the room. I'd like to also introduce my friend Marie Donheimer, she's one of my mentors. But, so I think it's kind of funny, the story of how I got into this profession. Remember when everybody, I don't know if Charlie will have this experience, but growing up, like what did you do to entertain yourself, besides go play in the creek? And I used to draw, like I just drew and drew and drew and drew, which I still do now. Like this little instrument is my favorite just to go to. But eventually that developed like into a career. I sort of went in the direction of science also, and I went to college, and when I got to college, it's funny, I didn't like to be told what to draw. I wanted to do my own thing, so I sort of stepped out of the whole art thing for a while, and I went into biology. I was actually a mathematics undergraduate major, and then eventually I decided to go into medicine. And after I got out of college, I was living in Richmond, Virginia with my parents, and I was working at the Medical College of Virginia, and I was working in the Department of Neurosurgery, and they were getting ready to publish a bunch of the docs were getting ready to publish a bunch of papers. And just like any magazine, you gotta have a cover and it's a picture or whatever, but it turns out that you could submit an illustration or a picture or whatever for the cover, so I was like, oh, we should do that. We should, and so they were like, okay, So I was putting together this sketch, and at the same time I was working as a lab tech in the Department of Neurosurgery, and this, it had been accepted by the journal, my little sketch had been accepted. And this is pre-PowerPoint, if you're like when you actually had a lecture slides that you put into the carousel with a click. So the guy would come in and take the printout, the piece of paper, and make a slide of it and he saw this sketch on my lab table, kind of like this. I decided to bring a few props tonight. And he saw this sketch sitting on my lab table, and he was like, well, what is that? And I told him, I'm gonna get the Journal of Neurosurgery cover. And not really knowing what that was, but he said, you should talk to my wife, she's a medical illustrator. This is Sue Seif. Mm-hmm. And I was like, what? Because it's such an obscure profession. And it's like, what, I was going to be a doctor, well, how would I be so I went and talked to this woman, and she told me about it. It's kind of like joining the art world and the science world. Like you get to draw what these people are studying, or they tell you about the surgery along the way. And it's so anyhow, I went to talk to her and I learned about the fact that medical illustration even exists, which was the first step. And then the next week, I live in Baltimore, I guess I neglected to mention that. But so I went to Hopkins to learn about how you might become a medical illustrator, and then eventually I went to grad school there, and I fell in love with Baltimore and haven't ever changed. I mean, I haven't ever left there. I just love Baltimore. But it's just this weird little story of how you find, like, how do you find out about that? Which is always the, like when people say, hey, what do you do for a living? And I'm like, well, I'm a medical illustrator, and they sort of look at me a little confounded, like, what is that? And I'm like, you know, and I don't tell, I mean, I say, when you're reading the magazine and there's that picture about high blood pressure, because a picture is worth 1,000 words, so you should probably put a picture in there rather than, you know, and they go, oh yeah. And then they realize that there is someone, and then always the response is, I guess somebody does do that. So, which is funny, so, but it's a really small little profession, but I gotta say I'm super fortunate to have found it because it does allow me to mix my interest of physiology in with the drawing of the physiology, or the anatomy mixed in with, well, the physiology. It's always the physiology, or I think it is. So it's, I brought some props. I'm just gonna, I have some loosely organized notes, and I'm just gonna toss a few things out there, and then in the end, I want to come and cycle back and talk about how this is, as a scientific sort of more sci-fi or fantasy sort of show. So I do. I was in Boston 2 weekends ago, and I got to see this really fantastic show. This Santiago y Cajal, who is a medical illustrator. He was actually the father of neuroscience. The majority of his drawings were done from 1838 until 1956, I think it is. He won a Nobel Laureate Award in 1905 for his research in understanding what neurotransmitters were. Back then, there wasn't electron microscopy yet, but he was studying underneath a microscope and doing these really, really intricate drawings, pen and ink and pencil drawings of these little tiny neurons. And it really wasn't true to life. And I just thought this book was, the show was really phenomenal. I was fortunate that a friend of mine said, hey, do you want to go to Boston for the weekend? And I was like, I can go see that show, yay. And so we went to the show, and there were these drawings that were about this big. That were chocked full of these really, really super intricate medical illustrations. And I was I'm just delighted and thrilled to be seeing these. And it's funny that this show also has these magnifying glasses, and I would go up there with my magnifying glass and be studying these really intricate cell things. And my friend came, and I was just sort of absorbed in the show, and my friend came over and was like, I'm really bored, I don't get what's going on. And I was like, oh no, because I wanted to be here for hours, and we had been there 10 minutes. And she's like an engineer by training, but she also sells medical, she sells heart valves. So I was like, she's got to understand a little bit about anatomy and the understanding of how it all works. So I began explaining to her about these little drawings. It's always better if I have a prop, like how this neuron connects into this neuron and loops back around, or this little tiny nucleus, in fact, is the pathway from the brain. Or when you prick your finger, it's not like, I mean, you feel ow, but really it goes back up to your brain and then it comes back. The sensation goes in both directions to deliver this sensation. And I was explaining all these in these drawings from 1905, that had like white out and pencil and tape, and they were all, but just the whole collage of the drawings I thought was really, really beautiful. And they allowed me to tell a story. that wasn't even my story, but I just was so enamored with these drawings. I feel like she was like, oh, like it became the story, and I feel like it got illuminated, and then she didn't really want to stick around for a couple hours with me, but she got into like having the whole story about neurology told to her. So I said, well, we're at the MIT Museum, there's 4 shows in this museum right now. If you don't like this one so much, you can maybe go check out another one. And so just like here, and she went on the other side of the wall, and there was this, an engineering exhibit of machines that when we were at MIT, where you didn't have a little handle, but they had an engine, and the machines, equally as delicate and beautiful, sort of worked their way through and were as amusing and eloquent, and she came back into the room with the neurons and was like, there's a really cool engineering exhibit in there, I'll be in there for hours. And so I was like, okay. But it was fun, and so, but it worked out that the pictures once again like told a story. I feel like that's really what medical illustration is about. It's getting to tell a story. I don't know. I mean, these have a more deliberate. Like I get told what the story is, where these guys come up with their own story. I think where I get told what my story would be. One of the other points I wanted to talk about was the different types of illustrations that I do. Currently working on this. It's funny, I do this really individual sort of stuff. I don't know why I just brought these magazines, because so the endocrinology is the study of hormones. So it's like really, you can't even really see it. Most of it is ideas, understanding the pathways, describing the physiology and the pathways. I do a lot of work for this magazine, which tends to be more editorial. Like we're talking about, it could even be a water pathway, or there's a lot of environmental impact issues in there. So it's a bigger picture. So it was really funny. I did an article for Dressage Today, like last year, which was trying this. It's a body worker guy who was talking about anatomy once again, and how how his massage helps to teach dressage workers about posture. So it's really kind of a gamut of all over the different types of illustration that I do. I also do I do work in the legal community. Pictures are worth 1,000 words. So if you're trying to educate the jury on where your spleen is, not everybody knows where your spleen is. So you can have a big anatomy picture up. So while the attorneys are talking about a medical malpractice case or a product litigation case, you can educate the jury with the visuals. Going back to your men's health or women's health, or once again, like exercise physiology comes up in a lot of the drawings. This is one of my favorite quotes. I'll read it to you. It says, "Medical illustrators draw what can't be seen, watch what's never been done, and tell thousands about it without saying a word." Which I think is really kind of a remarkable sort of phrase. Because you just kind of, like, you don't know what endocrinology mostly looks like. You kind of know a little bit what it looks like. But a lot of it is sometimes describing what the idea is about. I have a lot of kids that come through the studio, high school kids, college kids, middle school kids. Luckily, a lot of educators now are open to the idea of what arts are about. I think it's expanded a lot, like medical illustrators or scientific illustrators might be more of a common word than it might have used to have been. So I just brought like my heart in a jar. Like at one point in my career, I was doing a lot of cardiac illustration, and to really understand like what, it's kind of funny, there's a picture of this, something in a jar. But to really understand and draw, like let's say surgical illustration, it's helpful to understand the way that the tissues might be. As a medical illustrator, you actually go into the surgery and get to stand over top of the surgeon's shoulder, and we used to sketch back in the day and take photographs, and then you would go back and draw the procedure, because if they are explaining the procedure, the best way to do it is through pictures, right? And also that way it can be published, but to understand the textures and how the tissue works, a lot of times you would just go to the butcher and get a heart, or this is a sheep heart, I think. It just so happens that this book right here has something in a jar. There's a lot of people around the world that are fascinated with having collections of weird stuff. This is it's some weird eyeball thing. I don't know. This is actually a book about a collection that's at the Volk Museum, which is in Amsterdam. I was fortunate enough to meet with the director and go through the museum. Pretty much like any city that you go to in the world, there's some weird medical museum. Like think about the Mutter in Philadelphia. What do we have here?
The National Museum of Health and Medicine.
Yeah, that's a great museum. But it used to be that these were private collections of weird stuff. I mean, people have weird hobbies. They collect weird stuff. And then it often will get eventually turned into a museum. So that's just an example. One of the other things that I wanted to talk about, and I'm hoping this will lead into some questions, also about the exhibit, is the idea of, as a medical illustrator, I wanted to talk about like micro and macro. So a lot of what I draw is on a very small, on a microscopic level, but sometimes the concepts are on a macroscopic level, which I think applies to a lot of artists in general. Like, I've never been one of those people that like paints ideas, that like paints something, where I guess that's expressionist versus more internal sort of drawing, impressionist. But I always use the example of a circle, that a circle can be a pea, it can be an eyeball, it can be a jar top, it can be a fence, which can be a boundary outside or inside. And if I keep growing, it can be a universe, it can be an idea, it could be something sort of esoteric, or it can be something concrete. But the idea of micro and macro sort of is fluid in the definition and how it gets defined. When I'm drawing a cell, but the cell I'm going to go back to physiology, because to me it all goes to physiology, but the cell gets defined within a physiological concept, which ultimately controls the component of a body, a working body, I guess, which then affects a greater concept or a population, which then can affect a city. So it can go, the idea of micro and macro, I think, is really relevant as well. So with that, I'm kind of leaving it loosey-goosey.
Are you wanting to open it up to questions?
Yeah, I was wanting to open up. with questions about whatever, and then allowing that.
Yeah, wonderful. Do you have a question?
I do have a question.
Great.
Well, thinking about, she has a question too. Thinking about this idea that you are illustrating and drawing things that people cannot see, including things that are not visible. In a way, how much of your creativity can you put into that? How much of it is your interpretation, or how much are you allowed to say that you're interpreting what you're illustrating versus how much are you trying to, as accurately as possible, depict?
Which was really, that's interesting, because there's a really beautiful statement about this exhibit, and I was thinking about this question. The artists in this exhibition share an interest in the role of science fiction, which you started with first, scientific fact and fantasy, and the changing nature of our relationship to our fears, ideals, and questions about being a human being, recognizing that our retelling of the past changes constantly, and then opening ourselves to new possibilities can help identify with the biases in our accepted histories. The artists in this exhibition create their own worlds, and including cultural references and artifacts. But so I was like, how much of that do I do? Because you can embellish a little bit. So I mean, some of it is really, really to the micrometer, but sometimes the idea, like this needs to be specific, but how the idea is conveyed, once again, it's the micro going into the macro. So you can embellish the background, or you can embellish the setting, and so there's some of you can make up, not really, but it depends also if it's for a peer-reviewed art journal where everything has already been this is non-negotiable. But when I'm working for something that's much more editorial, sure, you can have some fun with it and be. So I guess that the answer is it depends what the audience is, but it's fun to like push the boundaries sometimes. And like going back to Kajal, like it was really fascinating when he was trying to talk about the depth of neurons upon neurons upon neurons. He did what I did, only he did it with pen and ink. So he would have like pen and ink in this layer, and then water it down a little bit, and water it down a little bit, and water it down a little bit. Where I do that in Photoshop, on the computer, where he actually did it with the actual technique of the pen and ink. So to create a neurological space. So space is actually the eyeball, but in relating back to the exhibit spaces, so it's like a cosmos, and there's different tricks of how you can make that happen. I always like it when the art director is like, oh, just do what you think.
How do you receive the assignments? Do they come, you said an art director, so they come from somewhere and then you get to choose which ones you want to work on? Like, oh,
Yeah.
this hormone is very interesting, or?
Well, for the journal, we have a regular schedule. I heard a really great article on NPR last year, and it was, I think I listen to public radio a lot. I love the stories, and it was this. I don't know. He was talking about physiology. I'm sure he was talking about as you age, some of your senses dull down. I mean, I'm wearing glasses, right, and you can't hear as well. But he was talking about the effect of taste. So if people invite you to go out to dinner, and as if you can't really take, he said as you age, eventually, or some people it just tastes like porridge, because I think he's from Finland, and so he was saying, so when people say, hey, do you want to go out to dinner, you're kind of like, no, why would I go and pay money to go out to dinner? And plus, when you go out to dinner, what do you talk about at the dinner table? You talk about how great your meal is, and if it tastes like porridge, then you just don't really share in that experience, so you end up declining that social activity. because you can't share in the experience. So I wrote him and said, I thought your article was fascinating. Is there any interest in having an illustration done for that? And so he said, yeah. And he said, as a matter of fact, with our ongoing research, I would like to continue to have some illustrations. And when we, and some of my graduate students were gonna probably need some illustrations. But that's not the normal way. But I thought that was really fun. Like when you hear something, like, oh, I maybe want to be engaged in that, which worked out. I have a friend of mine who's a solid molecular biologist. He teaches at the University of Maryland at Baltimore County. And he had a poster session, like a scientific poster session with his students. And it's this big, so at scientific conferences, you're usually asked to give a lecture or to give a poster presentation. So at the lecture you present, and then the hallways are filled with these posters, and the different docs can all talk with each other about their different research. And he wanted his students to do one of these posters. And he gave them all a cell type. And it was like, do the research and make a poster session. And he brought me in to be the art director and talk to them about, how it's organized. So it was fun to be on the other end of it. And teaching the kids more about, not because by no means were all of them, even though it was a biology class, by no means was it all science people.
Well, it's kind of twofold. I wonder if being a scientific illustrator, if that has affected the way that you approach and interpret artworks, like fine artworks, and or music or anything. If you take any of your techniques into that, and if so, if there were any pieces in this show that you found yourself approaching that way as a scientific illustrator.
I really like spinning little wheels and watching the whimsy going on, and it has nothing to do really with scientific. That just has to do with the whole entertainment factor. But yes, there's definitely, I think all the pieces in this show attention to detail. I'm like, even the pieces, the collages on the windows that are bigger gesturalization. They each have such intricate little parts to it, like leaves and sticks and trees, and it's either expanded or contracted is the way that I saw it. And I think that, so it's a micro that's made a macro once again, but this looks like scientific research to me, literally, but with a sense of humor and a lot of curiosity in there. So that doesn't really answer the question then.
That's okay.
But it just, I guess, as a scientific illustrator in general, I don't know if it's also being a daughter of a doctor. I'm really critical visually, like I don't even realize I'm doing it, but if I left this room, you could ask me like where anything was, and I'd be like, well, it's to the left of the lady with the red shoes foot, and But I just absorb so much in visual information constantly, and I'm like putting it together and taking it apart. I think I guess maybe that comes from the medical profession, or watching people and their actions, the way that they're watching you, or their responses, or pain or discomfort, or happiness, or pleased, or satiated. But I don't know if that's coming from me, or just being a scientific illustrator or a medical illustrator, or just because I'm kind of nosy about people. Like, I really like to learn about stuff and about people. But are all scientific illustrators curious? I guess you have to be.
Well, we can get a second perspective.
We could get a second perspective. So Marie also does, I was going to talk about your morbid anatomy background.
Okay.
Well, I shouldn't say that. Well, because that's a whole different level of
Because, well, that's kind of an interesting question, because a lot of times people look at medical illustration, medical images, and they see this kind of macabre. I mean, like I think a lot of medical illustrators, maybe a lot of people here, that, the heart, it's actually very beautiful. It's got a beautiful sculptural quality, texture, and, but some people would be put off by that. But I was doing a lot of work with the Morbid Anatomy Museum and Library in Brooklyn, and I was teaching 19th century medical and scientific illustration techniques that I thought I would be sitting in a room by myself, that nobody would be interested, and actually had a lot of interest, and taught the class several times there, and then at the New York Academy of Medicine, and then at the Vrolijk in Amsterdam. And was really shocked that people were really fascinated by learning about anatomy by drawing it. And it was a really exciting experience. But I think a lot of times when I go to art museums, I have a little bit of a background in art history. I minored in art history in college, but when I was at the Kajal show at the MIT Museum, I thought a lot of them looked like Murrows. But there was a Murrow influence.
Well, I was one with a microscope looking at looking at the detail. So
yeah, absolutely.
Well, so do different illustrators have different style?
Absolutely.
You're trying to recognize, you're trying to be true to life, but I'm sure.
Well, but also it's funny, in medical illustration, just like there's trends, like when, I don't know what magazines you all subscribe to, The Economist,
Audubon.
The Audubon, but it seems like contemporary, it just grabbed everything that was sitting on my counter, which was also, I noticed the Chesapeake Bay, and there's trends in illustration in general, I think, which those trends do not pass over into medical illustration. There's no collaging going on in medical illustration, really. It might be a little bit for an editorial sort of illustration, but the art director is probably going to hire somebody outside of the medical illustration field, so there's definitely a palette. Sometimes it can be a little dull, I think. I wish, but there's definitely a style, and there's an exactness of the types of illustration that need to go on with medical illustration. It might be, I guess I didn't ask if anybody here has a scientific background.
No.
So it seems like
As
it's
someone said in our last, or 2 lectures, we're all scientists. We're all empiricists.
Have curiosity?
Well, curiosity, sure, but I think their point was we're all scientists. We're all interacting with the real world every day.
Yeah.
We're calculating, we're assessing.
Yeah.
I remember that Michelangelo, who was a terrific, you just can't put him in a category, he's so great, but he studied the anatomy of humans when people weren't studying anatomy of humans, so he would know how to draw the human body. And, so artwork has come a long way.